War was to become the fate of a generation of Jews living in Palestine, the land of Israel. They, and often their parents, were people who had struggled and built for half a century, inspired by a dream of Jewish sovereignty. And they were to be joined by Jews from Arab countries, and by those who had survived the European tragedy and longed for a homeland free from persecution.
Egypt? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
Resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstained.
At the end of the Second World War, the Jews of Palestine were determined to establish a state, the first manifestation of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel for 2,000 years. On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations voted to establish two states, one Jewish, one Arab, in a partitioned Palestine. The Arabs swore to resist the creation of a Jewish state even by war. This film is the story of that war. This is the land of Israel, also called Palestine since the Roman conquest 2,000 years earlier. It was some 300 miles long and 40 miles wide, a land that had been fought over for centuries. It would now be fought over once again. The partition plan gave the Jews of Palestine a small state within the land of Israel. Areas of predominantly Arab population were to become part of the Arab state, including most of the Galilee. Predominantly Jewish areas would remain Jewish. The Negev was given to the Jews. Jerusalem at the map's center was to be internationalized. The British had conquered Palestine during the First World War, and the League of Nations had authorized a British mandate to govern the country. Palestine seemed somehow not a mandated territory, but part and parcel of the British Empire, an empire that found itself under siege after the Second World War, as more and more people strove to become independent. The British had ruled Palestine for 30 years. More than 30 British forts were scattered throughout the country. They controlled strategic roads and junctions. The forts were built in 1936 against the Arab revolt. In 1948, as the British prepared to withdraw, each one became the scene of a bitter struggle for control between Jews and Arabs. This fort at Gesher was located near the railway crossing of the River Jordan that connected Palestine to Transjordan and Syria. At the center of the country at Latrun, this was the police fort, which dominated the entrance to the gorge leading up to Jerusalem from the coastal plain. The Jewish population of Palestine was only 600,000 when the War of Independence began. Yet from that small community, there emerged a group of leaders of rare quality. They were a generation that had hoped to be farmers and builders of the land, but were made leaders by a tumultuous series of events. David Ben-Gurion was the leader of the Jewish community and became the first Prime Minister of Israel. Yigal Allon was a military commander of excellence and daring, a native-born Israeli. His associate, Yitzhak Rabin, was also native-born. Yigal Yadin was a brilliant strategist who became Army Chief of Staff and later a world-renowned archaeologist. Moshe Dayan also made his mark in Israel's War of Independence. He was both a warrior and later a statesman. Menachem Begin was the leader of the Irgun, committed not to partition but to Jewish sovereignty in the entire land. The Jews of Israel were divided into a number of armies or military groupings. All of them had been underground armies during the Mandate, conducting training far from the eyes of the British police. The Haganah was the strongest of the pre-state armies. It reported to the head of the Jewish agency, David Ben-Gurion. As the war started, the Haganah had 32,000 part-time soldiers registered and about 13,000 weapons, mostly rifles. The Haganah had scarcely enough ammunition for 3 days fighting. The Palmach was the elite commando unit, drawing much of its membership from collective settlements, the kibbutzim. It was also part of the Haganah, but had a semi-independent command. On the eve of war, the Palmach had 3,000 fighters in its ranks. The Etzel, or Irgun, was a right-wing force. Its members engaged in terrifying acts of violence against the British and the Arabs. The Irgun had some 2,000 fighters within its ranks. Directly after the United Nations decision to partition Palestine, the euphoric dream of Jewish statehood in the land of Israel was punctured by the harsh reality of gunfire. 3 days after Arab snipers attacked a civilian bus on the Mediterranean coast, killing 5 Jews, Arabs stormed the Jewish commercial center in Jerusalem, outside the Jaffa Gate, causing havoc and destruction, and nearly burning it to the ground. No one was killed, but the Jewish population was in shock. In Jerusalem and elsewhere, Arab and Jewish communities were already in a state bordering on war. British patrols sought to secure peace and order within the country. Meanwhile, the British formulated secret plans for their departure from the country. The leader of Palestine's Jews was David Ben-Gurion. He was respected and even feared by his colleagues. Ben-Gurion wanted to fight the Arabs, curb the power of the dissident Irgun, and forge a Jewish nation. His vision of a democratic Jewish state and his strategy for attaining it shaped the fight of the new Israelis against their enemies. Some of Ben-Gurion's decisions, judged by conventional military standards, were unusual. He was determined to hold Jerusalem, the historic religious symbol of Jewish statehood and nationhood, and to hold it against all military advice. The city was far from the coastal plain, subject to Arab siege, and extraordinarily difficult to defend. Ben-Gurion was also committed, against military advice, to the defense of every single Jewish settlement. Just to the south of Jerusalem was Gush Etzion, a group of 4 small collective settlements, or kibbutzim, with only a few hundred residents. Gush Etzion was located outside the borders of the Jewish state in the United Nations partition plan. In early January, a Palmach officer, Uzi Narkis, became the Gush Etzion commander.
Immediately, when I look at that block, I understood the block was doomed. There was no opportunity, no chance for those 4 little kibbutzim, tiny kibbutzim, already besieged, to survive.
Convoys to Gush Etzion from Jerusalem had to pass through a number of Arab villages and Arab-controlled roads. Within a few days of Narkis's having arrived, Arabs from surrounding villages attacked the settlement.
On January the 14th, in the morning, I think that never in my life I saw so many Arabs in that valley here, which is called the Valley of the Blessing. And all of them, so many, thousands, were moving slowly, mainly towards Kfar Etzion,
Narkis got a message by radio from a nearby kibbutz that the Arabs had stopped to eat breakfast before their assault. That pause provided the opportunity. Narkis authorized an attack.
So the Palmach platoon caught them in the middle of eating, stormed them, attacked them, and all of them withdrew, killed or injured or whatever. And that was really the break of the attack.
The Jewish troops were left with little weaponry and almost no ammunition. Narkis requested help from the Palmach Command Center at Kibbutz Ma'aleh HaHamisha. A special mission was authorized. On January the 15th, 35 men, including many students from the Hebrew University, set off on foot through the Judean hills at night to bring reinforcements to the defenders of the Etzion block. They had no radio. An Arab whom they met apparently misdirected them and then mobilized the Arab villagers against them. All 35 were killed. Arabs from the surrounding villages gathered to view the dead. These photographs were captured later by Israeli forces. The bodies were mutilated.
That was really very, very tough, because the Arabs, Palestinians at that time, listen, you killed your enemy, okay. Why do you have to dismember him?
The killing of the 35 brought home the reality of a brutal war to Palestinian Jews. The funeral was somber. Pictures of the mutilated bodies were not released to the public. The civilian leader of Kibbutz Kfar Etzion was David Ben David.
That was a shock. And we were afraid that the fate of the 35 could be our fate as well. There were many opinions. Some were more strong, some were not so strong as I was. But that gave us the feeling that a very hard fate is going to happen to us.
In February, for perhaps the first and only time, Ben-Gurion authorized a withdrawal from a settlement. This is the youth village of Ben Shemen, located near the Arab city of Lod and outside the Jewish state according to the United Nations partition plan. This film, shown here for the first time, was taken by one of the teachers of Ben Shemen and sat in a desk drawer for 50 years. The youngsters were mainly survivors of the Holocaust. British soldiers, together with Haganah guards, accompanied the youngsters. They traveled to Kfar Vitkin, a village in Jewish-held territory on the Mediterranean coast, where they hoped they would find safety. To the north of the country, the battle was also developing. The northern cities were mixed, including both Jews and Arabs. Haifa, on the seashore, was the country's main port and still under British control. The British were using their power to stifle Jewish immigration. Though most of the Galilee was populated with Arab villages, Israeli kibbutzim were scattered throughout the area. An Arab Liberation Army under Kaukji operated with the support of the vaunted Syrian army. It controlled the plains of the north. On the 16th of February, Kaukji's forces attacked in the Jordan Valley at Tirat Tzvi, a religious kibbutz. The Jews staved off the attack. 1 Jew and 40 Arabs were killed. To save face, the Arabs claimed a great victory with 300 Jewish dead. In Jerusalem, the battle was also developing. On the 22nd of February, there was a major explosion on Ben Yehuda Street. 47 Jews were killed, 130 were wounded. The Jews were furious. They suspected the involvement of deserters from the British Army, helping the Arabs plant the bombs. On the 11th of March, there was yet another explosion, this one at the Jewish Agency building in the center of Jerusalem, effectively the seat of Jewish government. A car filled with explosives was left at the entrance by a previously trusted Arab employee of the United States Consulate. The explosion killed 12 Jews. The Arab villages surrounding Jerusalem created a stranglehold on the city, cutting it off from the coast. The Arabs would harass and attack convoys, causing casualties and death. The Palmach's crack Harel Brigade was given the job of holding the road to Jerusalem. Among those with the brigade was a 17-year-old nurse, Tzipi Neria.
On that hill, that one with the beautiful fir tree, the Arabs waited there, and they'd informed the Arab villages around here that we were coming. There was the village Beit Mahsur, Saris, and other Arab villages. They'd wait over there, inform all the other villages, and then they'd be waiting for us on the road. They'd come down to the road itself, firing at our tires. Simply, it became face-to-face battle. They got that close to our convoys.
Each convoy was a desperate venture. A number were stopped. There was looting and killing. Many Jewish lives were lost. Some convoys got through. As the battles continued, the myths and legends grew. One young poet wrote at the time, "The convoys broke through to the city. On both sides of the road our dead are piled up. The iron skeleton is as quiet as my friend, Bab el-Wad. Remember our names forever, Bab el-Wad, on the road to the city." The iron skeletons still stand on the road to Jerusalem, reminders of the battle. Directly following the Second World War, European Jews had tried desperately to gain entrance to Palestine, but were blocked by British restrictions. Many of these Jews were Holocaust survivors. They dreamed not just of refuge in the land of Israel, but of a secure life in a Jewish state. British surveillance of the Palestine coast was constant, though the British managed to keep many Jews out. They principally succeeded in making the Jewish refugees only more determined to reach the land they regarded as home. The Haganah ship Unafraid was one of those stopped. When caught, the refugees were shipped to detention camps on the island of Cyprus, some 200 miles away. Some European Jews, however, had already sneaked through the barrier of British surveillance. Among them was one of the few who knew how to shoot a machine gun, a Holocaust survivor who had been a partisan fighter in the forests of Poland, and then afterwards had trained others at the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. His name, Menachem Ullman.
I took a choice to come here, to create a country, to marry, to bring up children for everyone who was killed in the Holocaust in Europe. This fighting here was like to be in Warsaw in the ghetto. No chance to go out, but we have to fight.
April 1948. It became known as the Cruel Month. It was both cruel and crucial, a month that would determine the direction of the war. Inside Jerusalem, there was fighting to control individual neighborhoods. There were Jewish victories, but also losses. The Arab siege on Jerusalem tightened. Jewish Jerusalemites had barely enough to eat or drink. Each drop of water was precious. It was estimated that only 2 weeks' food supply stood between Jerusalem and starvation. Shelling came from the old city and Arab villages around Jerusalem. Jewish areas were held, but there was no territorial contiguity, making effective defense difficult. The Jewish quarter of the old city, populated mostly by religious Jews, was reinforced by Haganah and Palmach fighters. On the outskirts of Jerusalem, Arab villagers and irregular troops surrounded the city, assaulting the convoys bringing food and supplies. The Jews suffered terrible losses. Menachem Ullman was an eyewitness.
Memories of death and life, of sacrificing, patriotism, of united people, that they have been ready to do everything. And the name of the action was Death of Victory.
So in early April, the Palmachs stationed in the hills around Jerusalem planned an attack to free the Jerusalem corridor so that food and other supplies could be brought into the city. This footage shows Arab troops preparing for battle on one of the hills around Jerusalem. The cameraman was with the Arab troops as they attacked. The Arabs are practicing the capture of a Jewish settlement just outside the city. Each village around Jerusalem was crucial to the control of the city. Only a few miles outside Jerusalem was this magnificent hill, with a view stretching out all over Judea down to the Mediterranean Sea. It was called the Castell, or Castle, and the remains stand where there had once been a Roman and later a Crusader fort. Arab control of this hill at Castell cut off Jewish Jerusalem from the coast. On April the 3rd, Jewish forces captured the hill, but after a continuous 6-day battle, they were driven off. Their last order became a watchword: all privates will retreat. All commanders will cover their withdrawal. On the evening of the 8th of April, the Jews still held the hill, though thousands of Arab irregulars were approaching ever closer. One of the platoon commanders on the Castell was Menachem Ullman.
The one who sit on the castle control all the area. And the commander was, the Palestinian commander was Abdul Qadir Husseini. And he sent everybody who could, thousands of them. In the last attack, we let them come in until the fence because we have been short of bullets. They have reported before they came to the fence that they already inside. But then we pushed them back. Then later, after half an hour, a jeep with United Nations came. He wanted to see our commander. Then he said, "You don't know at whom you kill. Abdul Qadir Husseini is dead here on the road."
There was a massive funeral for Husseini in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, the area called by the Arabs Haram el-Sharif, the holy sanctuary. Husseini's death sowed disillusionment in Arab ranks. Their best commander had been killed. On the same day as the funeral, the 10th of April, there was another disaster for the Arabs, one with a profound political effect. Forces of the Irgun Jewish army attacked an Arab village, Deir Yassin, and conquered it. But there were more than 200 Arab dead, many of them women and children. The regular Jewish leadership was aghast and disavowed the attack. Arabs elsewhere abandoned their homes, fleeing in the hope that they would return shortly afterwards behind the conquering Arab armies. A main Arab objective was the Jewish quarter of the old city. Jews had lived here for hundreds of years, within walking distance of the Wailing Wall. Arab shelling was continuous. On April the 13th, a kindergarten was hit and 20 children injured. As the siege continued, the hardship and distress inside the quarter intensified. So did the shelling. The Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus, adjoining the Mount of Olives and situated next to the Hebrew University, was connected to the rest of Jewish Jerusalem by a narrow road through an Arab quarter. Hadassah was Jerusalem's main Jewish hospital. Supported by an American women's organization, It served both Jews and Arabs, but there was no immunity from the spreading violence. On April the 14th, a Jewish convoy was driving along this road. It was bringing with it doctors, nurses, medical supplies, and patients to the Hadassah hospital. Arab gunmen opened fire, pinning the convoy down. 77 Jews were killed. A young American girl wrote in her diary, "All Jerusalem is walking around asking itself, is there no end to it?" In the country's north, the hills of the Galilee were as fertile in mid-April 1948 as they are today. The farmers, Jews and Arabs alike, wanted to harvest their crops before full-scale hostilities broke out. The British planned to evacuate the area's police stations, but would not say exactly when. As the Arabs planned their attacks, emergency meetings took place in the kibbutzim. Ben-Gurion's order was to hold every Jewish settlement. By mid-April, despite fierce Arab attacks, not a single Jewish settlement had been lost. On April the 15th, the British evacuated the police forts at Safed and here at Nebi Yusha, strategic points controlling the eastern Galilee. This elite commando unit prepared a two-pronged surprise attack on Nebi Yusha. Many of these young men lost their lives. The attack was driven off. The Palmach was defeated for the first time, a failure that shocked Jewish morale. Yair Parag was one of the fighters.
In one night, half of our people were killed or severely wounded. 22 people, mostly from one group living in one kibbutz, coming from the same youth movement.
Elsewhere, there were startling successes. On the 18th of April, the British evacuated the police fort in Tiberias. After Arab attacks, Jewish forces took the initiative and cut the city in two. The Arab civilians fled, leaving the city under Jewish control. A few days later, with the British secretly laying plans for their final departure from Haifa, the Haganah determined to seize the city and thus open up its port to Jewish immigration. In the battle for Haifa, the Jewish and Arab forces were evenly matched, about 600 fighting men on each side. At sunset on April the 20th, the Haganah launched a pincer attack on the Arab quarter from the port below and the upper town above. The Haganah appealed to the Arab population to stay in Haifa, but most Arab civilians fled, leaving the city to the Jews. The fighting was fierce. The Jewish forces were stunningly successful. In the fighting, there were dead on both sides. The battle ended on April the 22nd with a Jewish victory. As the Arab leaders left Haifa, they told the Jews, "We do not recognize you, and we shall return when you are no longer here." On the 24th of April, the British evacuated the police fort at Semach, at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. The Jews succeeded in taking it over. Just a few days later, a few miles to the south, the police fort near Kibbutz Gesher became the scene of battle. As the British evacuated, Jews from Kibbutz Gesher seized the police fort. Gesher means bridge, and 3 bridges cross the River Jordan at this spot, one of them dating from Roman times. The Haifa-Damascus Railroad crossed the Turkish bridge. The railway station nearby and the bridges were strategic points that controlled the crossing between Transjordan and Palestine. Suddenly, on the 27th of April, the Jordanian Arab Legion, a British-trained and well-armed regular army, appeared on the Jordanian side of the river. The young men and women of Gesher, few of them more than 30 years old, had limited military training. The kibbutz children had already been evacuated. At a kibbutz meeting, it was decided that one person from each married couple with children would be sent away to safety. Among those present was Dubi Bar.
We decided that from every family, one family with children one of the parents shall be outside, that the children shall not be orphans of the two parents, only of one. And we decided that mostly the mother is going out, living here, and but in some cases the mother was more important for the defense of the place than the father, and the decision was that he who is more important for the defense of this place shall remain here.
Facing determined Jewish resistance, the Arab Legion halted and turned. The Arab Legion forces from Gesher were transferred to the Jerusalem front. Skirmishes throughout the city were already determining the outlines of Jerusalem's neighborhoods. The Jews, desperately short of food and ammunition, decided nonetheless to go on to the attack, to link up the Jewish neighborhoods. On the 29th of April, Jewish forces attacked in the Katamon section. The key to the battle was the Greek Orthodox monastery of San Simon, held by Iraqi army troops. The Jews secured the position, making the monastery a Jewish command post. The Jews now controlled most of the western part of the city, though the Jewish quarter of the old city was beleaguered and cut off. Towards the end of April, on the 26th, the battle for Jaffa, a port city next to Tel Aviv, began. Jaffa was part of the area to be included in the Arab state under the United Nations partition plan. Irgun forces led the way in an attack coordinated with the Haganah. British shelling of Tel Aviv and an aerial attack on nearby Bat Yam were meant to help the Arabs. British soldiers fired on the Jews, who threatened to bring about the fall of this vital Arab city. By the 11th of May, the Jews had won. There was mass flight from Jaffa by the Arabs. Of 70,000 Arab residents, only 3,000 remained in the city. Almost simultaneously, the fight for the control of the eastern Galilee, in the north of the country, reached its climax. The Arabs of Safed had a reputation as tough fighters. When the British had evacuated in mid-April, a Palmach unit had infiltrated into the Jewish quarter in the upper city. For a period of several weeks, there was a stalemate.
Finally, we made one attack. It was unsuccessful. The morale was very low. The people of Safed shouted on us, "Why did you do it for us? Because otherwise we'd surrender to the Arabs and we shall survive and live. Now they will massacre all of us."
Palmach commander Yigal Allon infiltrated through Arab lines to organize an attack. On the evening of the 10th of May, the attack began.
In the morning, Safed was empty. About 15,000 people left in one night, and Safed was in our hand.
In Tel Aviv, the Jewish leadership was ever more determined to declare a state. They feared an invasion from regular Arab armies. One possibility for stopping the onslaught was to persuade the king of Transjordan, Abdullah, to remove himself from the coalition of Arab armies. Ben-Gurion designated Golda Meir as a secret emissary. She proceeded secretly at night with a small team through Arab-controlled territory. Last-minute efforts were made to avert war. On May the 10th, Golda Meir came here to the River Jordan and, disguised as an Arab woman, crossed the bridge to meet King Abdullah at his summer palace at Shuner. The king said there would be no war if the Jews agreed not to declare a state and if they halted all future Jewish immigration. This was unacceptable. Tens of thousands of survivors of the Holocaust were waiting to enter Palestine. If His Majesty wants war, Golda Meir told the king, there will be war. And she added, perhaps we will meet again soon, after the establishment of the state. With the state about to be declared, the Arabs renewed their attacks on the small Jewish kibbutz Kfar Etzion to the south of Jerusalem. The wounded were removed to a neighboring kibbutz. Arab irregulars then entered Kfar Etzion and massacred all who were there. Shortly afterwards, the Transjordanian Arab Legion expelled the irregulars and captured the neighboring Jewish settlements.
And the moment when the Jewish state was created, established, the last of us left the Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, and became prisoners of war.
On the 14th of May, 1948, Israel became a state. There was now Jewish sovereignty within a part of the land of Israel, after 2,000 years of dispersion. There was happiness on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The joy of the present obscured the looming dangers of what might happen on the morrow. On May the 15th, Egyptian Spitfires attacked Tel Aviv. Damage on the first day of all-out war was considerable. One Spitfire was shot down. The Arabs had shown that their fighter planes had a long reach right into the Jewish population centers. Military opinion was fairly unanimous that the state could not survive. Field Marshal Montgomery, who had commanded the victorious Allied armies in North Africa and Northern Europe, gave us his opinion that the state of Israel would be defeated within 2 weeks. The Arabs threatened Israel on every front. To the south, the Egyptian army prepared a full-scale attack on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. In the center, the Jordanian Arab Legion was already in Jerusalem and now reinforced its troops. They were joined by the Iraqi army. To the north, both the Syrian and Lebanese armies prepared for invasion. On May the 15th, the Syrians were poised to attack here at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. They advanced during the night. The two nearest Jewish settlements were evacuated. At Semach, 42 Jews were defending the former British police fortress. They fought for 2 days until all 42 were killed. In Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion ordered Moshe Dayan to the north with the words, "Hold the Jordan Valley settlements." Dayan rallied the forces for defense, but ammunition and arms were desperately short. At 4:30 on the morning of May the 20th, the Syrian army attacked Degania with tanks and flamethrowers. A bloody battle ensued. The Syrians were on the verge of victory when, at about noon, 2 Israeli artillery pieces, which had only recently landed at Tel Aviv port, arrived and opened fire. The effect was immediate, both physically and psychologically. The Syrians withdrew. Degania had been saved. A thrill of relief swept through the new state. Regular Arab armies could be defeated. Israel could survive. The artillery pieces were of French make, called Napoleonchiks. The Haganah's northern command had only 2 of them. They proved invaluable. To the south of Degania, the kibbutzniks of Kibbutz Gesher were reinforced by the Haganah. They had spent 2 weeks in training. They had more arms and ammunition than before. But, as if to confirm their worst fears, an Iraqi army force suddenly appeared on the Jordanian side of the river, where the Jordanian Arab Legion had been camped only 2 weeks earlier. On May the 16th, the Iraqis blew in the gate, and an Iraqi armored vehicle entered into the center of the fortress. It was quickly destroyed by the Israelis. For 7 days, the fort at Gesher was besieged, kibbutzniks and Israeli soldiers maintaining themselves against enormous odds. Then, on the 7th day, the 2 Israeli artillery pieces, which had successfully defended Degania to the north, were rushed south, opened fire, and the Iraqis fled. To the south of the country, in the Negev desert, the Israelis had several settlements. Holding the water line to these settlements was crucial. The Egyptians expected light opposition from the Israeli forces. The Egyptian army decided on a massive 2-pronged attack that would cut the country in 2. One force would cut through the Judean mountains to seize Jerusalem from the south, thus depriving King Abdullah of Jordan of exclusive control of the city. The main Egyptian force would push up along the coast towards Tel Aviv. This mock-up of a battlefield commemorates the 100 men and women who held out heroically against the attacking Egyptian forces for 5 days. On May the 19th, the Egyptians attacked here at Yad Mordechai, south of Tel Aviv. The defenders faced infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. On the second day of the battle, 18 men were killed. On the third day, the kibbutz signaled, "The men's morale is sinking. They approach exhaustion." One of the commanders of the threatened kibbutz was Munya Brandwein.
They attacked us with artillery, airplanes, and mortars. Their infantry advanced to a distance of 150 meters from our lines. We opened fire, we attacked, and then they had losses and they pulled back. We thought they would withdraw altogether. In those first 2 days of battle, we had 18 men killed.
Reinforcements arrived, but after 5 days of intense fighting, the kibbutz had to be abandoned. Those 5 days provided an essential breathing space, whereby arms and reinforcements could be sent north for the defense of Tel Aviv.
Here, next to me, my friends died. People I'd grown up with, people I'd known since I was a youth. Here, my friend's baby and my baby lived in the very same room. It was a spiritual problem. How could we personally stand up to what was happening and still endure? I said to myself, keep calm, stay under control. You have to take action against the invader.
The Egyptians believed that conquering Yad Mordechai constituted a great victory. Their army prepared a propaganda film to boast of the achievement. It was mostly simulated. At the kibbutz itself, the Egyptians staged a replay of the action. The only really true scenes of the battle at Yad Mordechai were these, filmed in the kibbutz cowshed. The Egyptian filmmakers showed how many cows their forces had killed. The Egyptian flag flew over kibbutz Yad Mordechai. In Jerusalem there were continual skirmishes. Ben-Gurion was determined to hold the city, but Jerusalem was still cut off from the coast, and food was scarce. When a convoy did get through with precious food and ammunition, it was a joyous event. It was not certain that the Israelis could defend the new city, much less the Jewish quarter of the old city. On the 27th of May, the old city fell. It was a heartbreaking end to a story of courage and of desperate hope. The Arab Legion freed the women and children, who were allowed to proceed to West Jerusalem. They held the men as prisoners of war. One of the Jewish fighters was Esther Kalingold, a religious girl originally from Britain. She was hit by a Jordanian shell on the last day of battle. When the Jewish quarter surrendered, Jordanian soldiers brought her, wounded but still alive, to the nearby Armenian monastery. Though on her deathbed, she refused the offer of a cigarette. It was the Sabbath, and smoking was forbidden. She had written to her parents just a few days earlier, "I am writing to beg you that whatever may have happened to me, you will make the effort to take it in the spirit that I want. For I myself have no regrets. We have had a bitter fight. I have tasted hell. But it has been worthwhile, because I am quite convinced that the end will see a Jewish state and the realization of all our longings. I am full of pleasure at the thought that you will come and enjoy the fruits of that for which we are fighting. Be happy and remember me only in happiness. Shalom and goodbye. Your loving Esther." Israel's War of Independence was fought by young people conscious of a special history. They fought for political independence, but also they felt for the very life and future of the Jewish people. The first months of war saw them stand their ground against an enemy determined to destroy them.
The feeling was that this is a terminal war. We fight not for a certain victory, not a victory in a certain battle, but the battle is for our physical survival of each one of us as a nation, of us as a group, and of our country, and of all our history.
It was the end of May 1948. Jewish independence was already a fact. In the words of the English girl, Esther Kalingold, whether others interfere or help us in our difficulties, we know we shall get over them. The confidence was great, but fighting was taking place all over the country. During several weeks of harsh fighting, the new Israel had defended itself against 5 invading Arab armies and had gained stunning victories. Much of the Galilee was in Israeli hands, from Tiberias in the east to Haifa in the west. In the south of the country, the Egyptian advance had been halted well short of Tel Aviv, although Egyptian forces straddled the northern Negev and had the potential for offensive action. In the center, the Arab Legion held most of what is known as the West Bank. King Abdullah hoped to annex that area to Transjordan. The western part of the city of Jerusalem remained Jewish but was under siege. The Jewish quarter of the old city and Judaism's most holy place, the Western Wall, were in Arab hands. The last big obstacle to holding the western part of Jerusalem was this police fort at Latrun. It controlled the entrance to the gorge up to the city. Unless the road to Jerusalem were opened up once and for all, Jewish Jerusalem would be vulnerable. Ben-Gurion decided to apply all available resources and pay whatever the price to capture Latrun. Menachem Ullman was a platoon commander in the battle.
We loved Ben-Gurion, but sometimes he took on himself things that he was not very professional. And he gave the order to take the people from the ship, the one who went from the concentration camp after the Holocaust, and to attack Latrun from the side of Tel Aviv. The people have not seen Tel Aviv, and a lot of them, they died here, right straight here.
It had been a searingly hot day. The attacking force lacked ammunition, and many did not even have water bottles. More than 100 Jews died in that first attack on Latrun, one of the heaviest losses ever incurred by Israel in a single battle. Many of those who died were Holocaust survivors, with no remaining family to mourn them. As the siege of Jerusalem intensified, a second attack on Latrun seemed imperative. It was launched on the 30th of May. The orders were to drive the Arab Legion from the police fort. 8 Israeli armored cars took part in the attack. They reached the walls of the fort, but were driven off under intense hails of fire. Among the fighters was a Holocaust survivor from Lithuania, Soli Gano.
The problem was to actually open the huge gate. It was a very heavy gate. And once we sort of broached it, the infantry was supposed to move in. And when we really came up quite close, and we were a few meters away, and there was nobody behind us, they started shooting at us from all directions, from the windows of the fortress.
The Arab Legion held the fort, and the Israelis were forced to withdraw. The road to Jerusalem remained blocked. With the Israeli army approaching exhaustion, a different route to Jerusalem had to be found. That route was found almost by chance. The failure to take Latrun meant that there was no road link to Jerusalem. 2 Israeli soldiers were given permission to go home on leave to the coast, provided they did so at their own risk. It was they who discovered this track. On June the 1st, it was used by a platoon of Israeli soldiers, followed by a single jeep. The track ran in the no man's land between the 2 armies, parallel to the road. As porters and mules rushed supplies along it to Jerusalem, construction began on a road that could take trucks. The building of the Burma Road, named after a Second World War supply route from India to China, ended the siege of Jerusalem. Nothing could now stop the supplies coming into Jerusalem. Still, with the ceasefire approaching, the Jordanian Arab Legion retained the Latrun fort. Ben-Gurion ordered Israeli commanders to launch a final attack. The Palmach Jerusalem unit was joined by additional forces brought down specially from the north. Among the fighters was Yair Parag.
There was no time to cooperate enough and to organize logistically between the 2 different groups. The one come from Jerusalem, one come all the way from Galilee. The result was a mistake that the local people occupied the wrong hill, although they were familiar with the area, but they made a mistake.
The attack failed. During the retreat, his commander told the lightly armed Yair Parag and 2 other soldiers to block the road against a possible Arab counterattack.
So we asked him and when to retreat, and he said, to what direction to retreat, he said. And which we understood that he planned that we stay here for good. And I can tell you that it was the only time during the whole war, and I was in war for the whole year, almost every night, only one time that I had the real feeling that today I am going to die.
That Arab counterattack never came. In the north of the country, under the shadow of Mount Hermon, the Israelis consolidated their gains. But in the last days before the ceasefire, both Kaukji and the Syrian army tried desperately for a single dramatic victory. The Syrians focused their attack here, at Mishmar HaYarden. The commander of a Haganah reserve unit here was Tzvi Raski.
I got an order from the brigade commander. He said that en route to us there were 2 guns, 2 65mm guns, from the area of Degania to the south of us. We got them finally, and we began to shoot at the Syrians. We shot about 10 rounds, not more than that, and then the Syrian attack broke, and they dispersed.
A second Syrian attack was foiled by a minefield. On the night of the 9th of June, with the ceasefire approaching, the Syrians attacked for a 3rd time, this time in an area unprotected by mines. They succeeded in establishing a foothold and then in overrunning the settlement. A ceasefire was agreed on the 10th of June. Both sides were exhausted. Here at Latrun, the ceasefire was supervised by United Nations officers. The bodies of the dead had lain in the sweltering heat for days and were beginning to decompose. Now, after the fierce battles, there was an exchange of the dead. In almost 4 weeks of continual combat against regular armies, Israel had lost 1,100 soldiers and civilians, a serious loss for a young country. But there was also a sense of exhilaration. It no longer seemed likely or even possible that the Arabs could destroy the state of Israel or wipe it from the map of the Middle East.
In the last few days before the ceasefire, I wanted very much to be wounded, to survive and to reach the ceasefire. Then I shall be alive after the war. But when the ceasefire came, we were very much disappointed because we had a feeling that we did not finish our business.
That first ceasefire came to us as dew from heaven, one Israeli commander proclaimed. Soldiers went home to see their families, their friends, their loved ones, for the first time in months. The first truce gave Israel a much-needed breathing space. Using its procurement agents overseas, Israel brought in arms and ammunition, thereby securing a slender but real advantage over its Arab enemies. The Israeli army, once a paltry force, had now grown to 49,000 men and women. Training intensified. A determined effort was made to get the planes that could form a real air force to counter Arab attacks. Some of the planes came from the United States, others from Europe, particularly from Czechoslovakia. Many of the young pilots were World War II veterans from the Allied armies, from America and Britain. The planes were the nucleus of the Israel Air Force. They were swiftly integrated into the order of battle to provide critical support to Israeli ground units. Among the ships carrying arms to Israel was the Altalena. Its hold contained enough arms to supply several battalions. The Altalena had been procured and supplied by the dissident Irgun movement, feared by Ben-Gurion as a separate private army with its political as well as military command. Irgun leader Menachem Begin and David Ben-Gurion failed to reach agreement on where the arms should go or who should get them. The boat arrived off Kfar Vitkin to the north of Tel Aviv. Ben-Gurion ordered the ship and its arms to be handed over unconditionally and within a matter of minutes. When the Irgun failed to respond, the Israeli troops were ordered to attack. A number of Irgunis and 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. The ship raised anchor and proceeded southward to Tel Aviv, where the beaches had seemingly provided welcome relief from the trauma of war. On board were many Irgun supporters and arms destined for the Irgun forces. Ben-Gurion was determined that there should be no independent private armies in the new state, and insisted that the Irgun give up both the ship and its arms. When the Irgun refused, he gave the orders to open fire. The Altalena incident threatened the young state with civil war. One of the army's best young commanders, Yitzhak Rabin, carried out the Prime Minister's command. Jews killed Jews, and valuable arms were lost overboard in the Mediterranean Sea. At the end of the day, Ben-Gurion won, uniting the army into a single undisputed command, though he had risked splitting the nation. Irgun leaders, including Begin, went to the funerals of their colleagues. The truce lasted until the 9th of July. What followed was a 10-day cyclone of Israeli activity that advanced Israel's positions in many places throughout the country. 4 areas were central to the new round of fighting. In the north, at Shfaram and Nazareth, the Israelis gained control of the remaining Arab villages and cities that could still form pockets of resistance. At the center of the country, just below the Galilee, intelligence and tactical failures cost the Israelis a clear victory. Iraqi army forces continued to hold this bulge near the Arab city of Jenin. And then there were 2 other places, Lod and Ramleh. Lod and Ramleh were Arab cities that had the potential to block free movement of Israeli forces to the Negev and to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and threatened the safety of Jewish areas along the Mediterranean. Under the overall command of Yigal Allon and the tactical leadership of Moshe Dayan, the Israelis moved to capture this area of large Arab population. Up to now, Arabs had fled their homes on their own initiative or that of their leaders. This operation marked a change in Israeli policy. The Arab towns of Lod and Ramleh were being used by the Arab armies as a base from which to attack the coastal plain. An Israeli operation was launched against them on July the 9th. On the following day, the Israeli Commando Battalion, led by Moshe Dayan, broke into Lod. The raid here only lasted for 47 minutes, but caused confusion among the Arab forces. 2 days later, Ramleh was occupied. Thousands of Arabs fled, encouraged to do so by the Israeli officers at Ben-Gurion's express command. The center of the country was now Israel's. Israel captured the country's sole international airport, built by the British near Lod, and immediately began converting it into an operational airbase. Scarcely 20 miles to the south, the Egyptians had set up their headquarters in the Arab town of Mijdal, part of Ashkelon today. This Egyptian film, captured several months later by Israel, shows Mijdal under Egyptian control. The Egyptians were convinced that their forces could not only hold the northern Negev, but expand those areas under Egyptian rule. Among the positions held by the Egyptians were the former British police stations at Iraq El Manshir and here at Iraq Swedan. The Iraq Swedan fort anchored Egyptian positions in the northern Negev, areas controlled by Egypt that came to be known as the Fallujah pocket. On the 12th of July, Egyptian forces from Iraq Swedan attacked Kibbutz Negba, only 2 miles away. A fierce fight ensued. A few hundred kibbutzniks staved off the attack of the regular Egyptian army, breaking their offensive. By the end of 10 days fighting, the map had been transformed again. There was a new ceasefire. Though the Israelis seemed more secure, most of the Negev still lay in Egyptian hands. The United Nations now pressed for a political solution that would stabilize the situation. Their chosen emissary was a distinguished Swede, Count Folke Bernadotte, a man who had helped Jewish refugees during World War II. Bernadotte traveled to the critical areas of dispute and formulated a compromise that most Jews interpreted as being pro-Arab. His plan, welcomed by the Egyptians and the British, would have left the entire Negev desert to the Arabs, not to the Israelis as formulated in the United Nations' original partition plan. On September the 17th, Count Bernadotte was driving to tea with the Israeli military governor of Jerusalem when his car was ambushed on this corner by the Stern Gang and he was murdered. His murder was immediately denounced by the government of Israel. Ben-Gurion ordered, arrest all Stern Gang leaders, surround all Stern bases, confiscate all arms, kill any who resist. The murderers of Bernadotte were never found. Only recently, biographies and recollections have indicated who in the right-wing group actually pulled the trigger. The war resumed on the 15th of October. The Israelis were desperate to free the Negev. They formulated a plan of attack against the Egyptian forces. The Egyptians were particularly adept at fighting from fixed positions. The fork at Iraq Swedan saw 7 battles between Israeli and Egyptian forces. Many Israeli lives were lost in head-on attacks. Finally, the Israelis bypassed many Egyptian positions and on the 21st of October opened an attack on the capital of the Negev, the biblical city of Beersheba.
To take Beersheba was relatively easy, and I do not know why. I think that maybe because the Egyptians lost the spirit to fight. They did not imagine that we will dare to capture the capital of the Negev.
After an exchange of fire, Egyptians inside the Beersheba police fort surrendered. The nearby mosque was also captured. At 9:15 in the morning of the 22nd of October, Israeli Brigade headquarters received the message, Beersheba is in our hands. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, a new general ceasefire was ordered. The Israelis had taken considerable territory. Kibbutz Yad Mordechai was liberated. The Israeli kibbutzniks, the residents of Yad Mordechai, returned to their homes. It was a somber homecoming. For 5 months the kibbutz had been under Egyptian military control. Much of it was destroyed. The Israelis' first job was properly to rebury the kibbutz members who had fallen. They had then to proceed with the reconstruction of their homes. Meanwhile, in the north of the country, the Israelis launched Operation Hiram, named after the king of Tyre in the Lebanon, who had sent cedars to aid King Solomon in constructing the first temple in Jerusalem in biblical times. The aim of Operation Hiram was to capture all of the Galilee up to the mandatory boundaries of the country. The operation was meant to destroy the remaining forces of Kaukji and his Palestine Liberation Army, and then expel Syrian, Lebanese and Iraqi forces from the country. The operation was brilliantly successful. Kaukji's army was totally defeated. Some 1,500 rifles were captured, and in addition, many machine guns, anti-tank rifles and food. The Arabs of Galilee now chose to stay in their villages. They surrendered. They did not flee, and many welcomed the Israelis. Throughout the areas controlled by it, the Israeli army sought peaceful relationships with the Arab villagers. Army units collected arms and ammunition from Arab villagers. It was the beginning of a new era. The Israeli state had promised equal rights to all its citizens, and Arabs who remained became citizens of the new state. Theory and practice were not always the same. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Arab villages were placed under Israeli military control, a situation that lasted for more than a decade. The Israeli forces entered both Arab and Druze villages. The Druze had their own religion, an offshoot of Islam. Many Druze had already chosen to ally themselves with the Jews, not the Arabs, and had actually served in the Israeli army during the fighting. Now all Druze villages joined in the close alliance between the Jews and Druze. The entire Druze population became citizens of the State of Israel. During November, the Israelis continued to make advances throughout the Negev. The Givati Brigade formed a cavalry unit that roamed the Negev, seizing terrain that motorized units found impenetrable. An effective ceasefire had been achieved on the Jordanian front. Israel saw the continued Egyptian determination to fight as an opportunity. The Egyptian authorities tried to conceal their weak position from their own public, afraid of criticism at home and even of internal unrest. On the 10th of December 1948, Yigal Yadin, director of operations of the Israeli forces, gave the order, defeat of the invading enemy and its expulsion to the boundaries of the country. In preparation for the battle, his operations officer, Yitzhak Rabin, secretly laid repairs to an ancient Roman road which led straight across the Negev into the Sinai. Battle began on the night of December 22nd, 23rd. Commanded by Yigal Allon, the Israeli forces freed the whole of the western Negev. The aim of the operation was not only to capture territory, but to compel the Egyptians to open negotiations for an armistice. The Israelis thrust forward in well-coordinated actions. Though there were some Israeli setbacks, the advance westward was rapid. Many Egyptian soldiers were taken prisoner. The Egyptian army was still a fighting force, but the large number of prisoners cast doubt on its future effectiveness.
We participated very actively and efficiently in an operation called the Horev campaign. Horev is one of the names of Mount Sinai. So the target, the objective of that operation campaign was to drive away the Egyptian army from the recognized frontiers of Palestine, namely Oj al-Hafir, today Nitzana.
It was here at Nitzana, on the 27th of December 1948, that the crucial battle took place for control of the western Negev. The Egyptian forces were astride the old Turkish railway line, strongly dug in and fortified. After a fierce battle, they were defeated, and many high-ranking Egyptian officers were taken prisoner. Hitherto, the Egyptian army had been fighting on Israeli soil. Now it had to look to the defense of Egypt itself. The Sinai sun had set on many wars. The end of this one was now at hand. With the route westward into the Sinai desert open, Israel wanted to secure the best possible terms for peace. Almost immediately, Yigal Allon ordered the Israeli troops to cross into Sinai. They advanced speedily, threatening to cut off the Egyptian army in Gaza. Egypt was suddenly ready for talks with Israel, though not while Israeli troops remained on Egyptian soil. The British, in support of Egypt, sent 5 planes to scout Israeli positions in Sinai. Israel managed to shoot them down, an incredible military achievement for Israel's young air force, and a humiliation for Britain. The downing only increased the political pressure on Israel. Ben-Gurion, under mounting British and American pressure, ordered his troops to withdraw. Israeli soldiers were already at El Arish in northern Sinai when they received the order. Yigal Allon and his deputy, Yitzhak Rabin, were unhappy. They thought that Israel could negotiate a full peace with Egypt before leaving Sinai. Israel withdrew. Within days, armistice talks began on the island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean. The Rhodes talks were chaired by the American-born United Nations intermediary, Ralph Bunche. The initial atmosphere was frosty. Though the Egyptians finally agreed to sit together in the same room, they refused to speak directly to the Israelis. The head of the Israeli delegation was Walter Eitan.
The Egyptians addressed their remarks exclusively to Bunche, as if we were not there. For us, we of course saw the Egyptians were there, and we were interested in including the Egyptians, but this distance was still artificially maintained for a little while, until one member of our delegation, and I can't remember now who it was, but one member of our delegation said something which offended the Egyptians, I think offended them terribly. So they immediately turned on him and said, "You have no right to say anything of the kind." And then all of a sudden they realized that they had spoken directly to the Israeli delegation. After all, they were only human, and when they heard something which annoyed them, they reacted directly. In that way, the ice was broken.
As a result of the armistice, signed on the 24th of February, Egyptian troops withdrew from the Fallujah pocket, fully vacating Israeli territory. The Egyptian general Said Taha, nicknamed the Sudanese Tiger, had fought well and was respected by the Israelis. Israel gained the entire northern Negev without further fighting. As part of the armistice agreement, Egypt retained control of the crowded Gaza Strip, where many Palestinian refugees had also gathered. With the Egyptian talks looking successful, there was a hope for peace on all fronts, and the beginning of normal life here in Jerusalem. The Israelis were eager to establish their state and their democracy. No symbol of viable democratic government was more potent than that of a parliament. Ben-Gurion decided on opening the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, at the Jewish Agency building in Jerusalem on the 14th of February 1949. The building was the same one that had been partially blown up by an Arab terrorist a year before. The Egyptian negotiations had left the disposition of the Negev open. Talks with the Lebanese and Transjordanian governments began on the 1st of March. The Jordanians had thought of claiming the Negev for themselves. The Israelis wanted it for Israel, as proposed in the United Nations partition plan. The last Israeli operation of the war was launched on the 5th of March 1949. Advancing southward through the Negev desert, 2 Israeli units competed to be the first to reach the head of the Gulf of Aqaba and the former British police post at Eilat, a distance of 150 miles. These actual films of the operation were taken by Israeli army photographers. The Israeli forces followed 2 separate routes through the Negev. Both brigades were under orders to avoid combat with enemy forces. Scouts from the air and on the ground established the location of Arab outposts. the Israelis advanced steadily through the dramatic desert landscape. The Negev Brigade reached the police station at Eilat at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of March the 10th. There had been no resistance. They also had no Israeli flag with them. They improvised in what Israeli law became known as the ink flag, a flag drawn only in ink. A message went back to headquarters: the Palmach Negev Brigade and the Golani Brigade present the Gulf of Eilat to the State of Israel. Meanwhile, the Jordanian negotiations continued. Borders were marked out in the Jerusalem area. Some thought the talks would fail. King Abdullah kept a delegation talking in Rhodes, but decided to conduct the substantive negotiations himself in Transjordan.
We received a message from the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, the grandfather of the present king, that he wanted to negotiate the basic terms of the armistice in person. In other words, he did not rely on his delegation in Rhodes to negotiate the details of the agreement, and we decided everything directly with him, and the decisions were then communicated to the delegations in Rhodes.
Talks resulted in significant border corrections. Israel got Wadi Ara in the north, including a series of Arab villages where Iraqi troops had occupied the hills. Wadi Ara provided Israel more direct access between the coastal plain and the eastern Galilee. Ben Gurion had wanted it desperately. In exchange, the Israelis gave up a small strip of land near Hebron. Another Israeli aim was to control the railroad that ran from the coast up to Jerusalem. Near Jerusalem, it went through the Arab village of Bet Safafa. King Abdullah agreed to give Israel the railroad and divide the village, expecting Israeli acquiescence in his own plans to annex the entire west bank of the Jordan. After the war, the situation of the Arabs was nowhere more bizarre than in this village of Beit Safafa, just south of Jerusalem. Under the armistice agreement, this railway and that part of the village to my right went to Israel, the village part to my left to Jordan. European railway carriages have a sign, "Do not lean out of the window." Israelis used to joke that carriages on this line had a sign, "Do not lean out of the state." Meanwhile, the doors of the state had been opened. The new state declared the right of return. Any Jew wishing to do so could come to the country and make it his. Jews poured into Israel. From the very first days of the new state, immigrants arrived here in Haifa port in their hundreds, their thousands, and their tens of thousands. They came from Europe, including survivors of the Holocaust, from North Africa, from the Americas, from Iran, Iraq, even from India. Just as the resources of the port were strained to its utmost in order to bring them in, so the state had to use incredible exertions to absorb them. With the war over, the Israelis had to think about demobilizing and then establishing a proper army to defend the state. The weaponry shipped into Israel during the war was enough to form the foundation of a peacetime army. Now there were thousands of trained, battle-tested soldiers. Israel was a viable country, capable of defending itself, governing itself, and ready to stand tall in the Council of Nations. The Israel Defense Forces had proved themselves in battle, but the Chief of Staff, Yigal Yadin, realized that a permanent army would be needed to defend the new state. Israel was too poor a nation to afford a large standing army. Yadin went to Switzerland, where he was impressed by the citizens' army there. Israel's citizens' army was based upon compulsory military service and an ever-growing pool of reserves. In March 1949, a British Jew, Bernard Beecham, decided to visit the State of Israel. Beecham had been a soldier in the Second World War, but had never served in Palestine. He was inspired by a vision to capture on film the feel of the life of the new state, and to do so in color. What follows is Beecham's extraordinary photographic record of life in Israel in March and April 1949. This was Lod Airport. Many years later, and many renovations later, it would become known as Ben Gurion International Airport. Tel Aviv was a small Mediterranean city. It was the aftermath of war, not too much traffic. Special concerts were offered. Many soldiers still wandered the streets. The hulk of the Altalena still hovered off the Tel Aviv coast. And this is Bernard Beecham, the jaunty photographer of Israel in its very first days, the ex-British soldier. Beecham went to Jaffa, still scarred by war. Here, the central bus station of Herzliya, north of Tel Aviv. After a few days, Beecham travelled to Jerusalem. The contrast with Tel Aviv could not have been greater. Jerusalem, high in the hills, is colder than Tel Aviv. In the first months after the war, it was a somber city, a city seemingly heavy with history, an incomplete city, marked by its recent strife and resulting division, to which the eternal stones of Jerusalem had been witness. It was a city that was destined to remain the capital of Israel. But in March 1949, it was a city permeated by the aftermath of battle. Beecham's cameras reached over the walls of division to document from afar the Transjordanian side of the city, which held many religious holy sites, including the Western Wall, Judaism's holiest site, but which the Jordanians refused to allow Israelis to visit. Beecham then went south. At the fortress called Iraq Swedan, he saw the remains of war. He visited the nearby kibbutz called Negba, that had so valiantly resisted Egyptian advances. Overseas volunteers working in the kibbutz kitchen posed for Beecham's camera. From kibbutz Negba, Beecham traveled further south to Beersheba, capital of the Negev desert. The reminders of war were everywhere. Bedouin soldiers now served in the Israeli army. city gave little hint of the metropolis it was destined to become, though the Israeli flag flew over it. The Bedouins who wandered the Negev desert still came to Beersheba to drink coffee in the town's cafes and to sell their goods. They would become Israeli citizens. From the Negev desert, Beecham traveled north. One of his stops was at a Jordan Valley kibbutz called Ashdod Yaakov. The kibbutz was a thriving enterprise. Its members could once again be farmers, not soldiers. Beecham approached the city of Tiberias from the southern end of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias commands a view of the Sea of Galilee and its sights. The city was still partially in ruins. There were warning signs, danger, mines. There were reminders of war everywhere. But the city seemed to be starting life again. The sense of renewed life was everywhere. The city and its nearby sites are precious to Christians. This is where Jesus spent his last years. Beecham climbed aboard a small boat to travel across the lake to the kibbutz Ein Gev, which stood directly under the Syrian guns on these hills. Armistice negotiations with the Syrians had not yet begun, but the guns were quiet. And here too, life was beginning again. Back in Tiberias, Israeli soldiers were out for some well-deserved R&R, rest and recreation. It was April 1949, and the incredible thing about the young people of Israel was their spontaneity. These were among the very first weeks and months of a new life for the people of Israel. Then, as if from nowhere, above the Sea of Galilee, there emerged a rainbow. Israel's War of Independence was a war for the establishment of a state, and also for the survival of a people. The fortunes of war determined the ceasefire lines. Armistice negotiations established borders that lasted for 19 years, until Israel was threatened once again. Those who fought in Israel's War of Independence remember it as the most dramatic and important period of their lives, a contribution to their people and its future. The State of Israel was now established. 6,000 Jews had been killed in the War of Independence, 1% of the population. The State of Israel offered a ray of hope that at the end of great suffering there could be rebirth and a new life. A people had returned to the land from which they had sprung.